If there is one value Donald Trump has made it abundantly clear he treasures above all others, it is blind, unswerving, slobbering loyalty. He values it over competency and principles, over his own political party affiliation, over the rule of law. And Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche's tenure atop the Justice Department has been defined by exactly that. So now Donald Trump is rewarding him for it. Here's Trump yesterday.
Tomorrow, I'm instructing Dan and everybody else that's involved in that very complicated process, which is going to go, I think, very quickly, that we are going to make him permanent Attorney General.
Permanent Attorney General. If you're wondering how Todd Blanche, a man who actually surprisingly now faces an uphill Senate confirmation battle, secured Trump's vote to be nominated for the top job permanently, look no further than Todd Blanche's dogged pursuit of Donald Trump's agenda of retribution and the complete politicization of the Department of Justice. For Todd Blanche, that comes seemingly without any limits. And he's done it in the barely 2 months since Pam Bondi was fired and Blanche was appointed acting AG. Almost as soon as Blanche assumed that role, he hired Trump ally Joe diGenova. Joe diGenova was hired to breathe new life into an investigation into former CIA Director John Brennan. Donald Trump, of course, blames John Brennan for the intelligence community's investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election. Todd Blanche led the effort to indict former director of the FBI, Jim Comey, a frequent target of Donald Trump's political attacks, for posting a photo of seashells. Todd Blanche approved an investigation into former Trump aide Cassidy Hutchinson. Hutchinson testified before the January 6th Select Committee about Donald Trump's role in stoking the events of January 6th. Todd Blanche also worked to vacate the seditious conspiracy convictions of members of the militia groups, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, for the crimes committed during the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. What a record, right? But there's more. Todd Blanche also oversaw the criminal prosecution of the civil rights organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center. Todd Blanche fought tooth and nail to defend, to actually sell to Congress Donald Trump's pet $1.8 billion slush fund, even as members of Trump's own party balked at the potential of buckets of cash going to people who assaulted police officers and were convicted for doing so. Even today, Todd Blanche is giving Donald Trump one of his most highly desired prizes in his insatiable quest for revenge. Our colleagues Ken Dilanian and Carol Leonnig report that former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton has agreed to plead guilty to a single count of retaining classified information. John Bolton could face up to 5 years in prison and a $2.25 million fine. John Bolton had been facing potentially more years than that. And while it remains to be seen whether Todd Blanche can make it through the Senate confirmation process and be the full-fledged AG, something that just 14 months ago was a guarantee for any Trump nominee because of the willingness of Republicans to greenlight everything. Now it's at least a question. But no matter what happens next, the stain that Blanche's blind loyalty to Donald Trump has left on the Department of Justice will live forever. Todd Blanche not only undermines the Department of Justice in which he once served and now leads, but takes aim at federal judges as well.
These activist judges that they have a robe on, but they are more political, or certainly as political, as the most liberal governor or DA. And you can't forget that. You can't forget that. A judge doesn't get a special place simply because a robe is put on them. My guys, the men and women that work at the department stay up all night, get an appeal in, stayed, go back to the district court judge. Judge still wants to just do whatever he or she wants to do. We need you because it is a war, and it is something that we will not win unless we keep on fighting.
So war against those judges? And you should win. Why? Because you stay up all night? Unsurprisingly, earlier this week, federal judges publicly warned that attacks by people like that and elected officials have eroded Americans' confidence in our judicial system. Donald Trump's continued attempts to dismantle the Department of Justice as we know it, brick by brick, is where we begin today with former federal judge Michael Luttig. Also joining us, New York Times investigative reporter Mike Schmidt, plus former DHS chief of staff during Donald Trump's first term, Miles Taylor, is here. Let me deal with one of the big stories of the day with you first, Mike. The news that the New York Times is reporting that John Bolton is expected to plead guilty to one count of retaining classified information. What do we know about how that came to be?
Look, the government had an enormous amount of leverage over Bolton in the sense that even if he went to trial, he lost, he could have faced decades in prison. And putting aside the merit of the case and whether it was brought as part of retribution and such, from Bolton's perspective, that was an incredibly risky thing to be confronting, of decades in prison. But by taking a plea deal, he will be essentially narrowing the amount of time he could potentially go to prison. The Bolton case has always sort of stood out in the retribution bucket. It's clear that Donald Trump wanted John Bolton prosecuted. It's clear that he wanted all of this to happen. The issue in Bolton's case is that the case had been brought by career prosecutors, which had been different than some of the Comey and James cases, which had been brought by more politically appointed prosecutors. And on top of that, the indictment against Bolton, if you read it, had a fair amount of his own texts and messages and such that showed his, exchanging of classified information. And look, one of the biggest issues that Donald Trump has had in terms of retribution is that he was told during his first term that you should not talk about the government going after your enemies, because if the government eventually does do that, the public will not trust what the Justice Department is doing because they'll believe that the Justice Department is doing it at your behest. Obviously, Donald Trump had completely ignored that, but it leaves us in a position today of saying, okay, did John Bolton accept this plea agreement because indeed, the government had a legitimate case against him, or did he accept this plea agreement because the Justice Department went after him and this was the best, outcome that he could have for himself?
Miles, you argue that this had very little to do with the law. Explain.
Well, look, as far as classified information cases go, Nicole, we are talking about a candle flicker versus a wildfire. And by a candle flicker, I mean John Bolton is alleged to have kept private diaries. He is not alleged to have taken documents home with classified markings. Compare that, a man who kept private diaries to write a book. He's not alleged to have put a single piece of that classified information in his book. Compared to Donald Trump, who took hundreds of pages of classified documents intentionally out of the United States government, kept them for what prosecutors were apparently prepared to allege was for personal self-interested reasons, refused to hand them back over to the United States government, was charged with it, and had the case dropped. The Trump case is vastly bigger, and he wanted to come back into government and find similar cases against his enemies. That's why I say this is not a plea deal. This was a shakedown. Now, the reporting indicates that some of this began during the Biden administration, but by all appearances, the Biden administration pretty much let this one go. Then the Trump administration comes in, his top officials get briefed that there was an open case into John Bolton, and they apparently get very excited about it, from the CIA to the FBI. So, look, what I would say is this. Doesn't appear that this is actually about the law or professional judgment. At the end of the day, this is about revenge. And John Bolton said something when he first got charged. He referenced a quote, Nicole, that you've used on this program before, of the head of Joseph Stalin's secret police in Russia, which was, "You show me the man, I'll show you the crime." Do any of us really think it's a coincidence that a dozen people who have written books critical of Donald Trump have been threatened by him or put under investigation? It is no coincidence. They showed the man to the Department of Justice. They went and found the crime. And I think this is a much, much bigger story about the threats to democracy, because Trump's revenge tour, because of this success, is going to enter its next phase.
Well, Judge Luttig, I guess the next phase begins officially with Todd Blanche. I mean, Todd Blanche has overseen the attempts, the unsuccessful attempts to indict Jim Comey and the then successful one to indict him over the Seychelles. He's overseen and defended the attempt to settle with himself, with the IRS, is what a judge seemed to surmise. He went to Capitol Hill and had the I think the legal term is chutzpah, to try to sell a slush fund for insurrectionists to Republicans who have a political boot on their throats because of Donald Trump's war with Iran and the ailing economy. I mean, Blanche is the attorney general that Donald Trump has been looking for since early 2017, when he was first reported by Mike and his colleagues in the New York Times to want Comey indicted.
Nicole, every word that Todd Blanche spoke on that replay at the beginning of your show was despicable and reprehensible. Prior to the Trump administration, there's not a public official in the land who had ever said anything like what the president himself has said and Todd Blanche just said about the federal courts and even the individual judges on the federal courts. That said, obviously, Todd Blanche was there and in many other instances has simply been parroting the words of the President of the United States. Todd Blanche is a classic puppet of the man in the highest office in the land.